Significant new information on Canada's startup visa program and high refusal rates on this edition of ImmPulse.
Hi, I'm Howard Greenberg.
Hi, I'm Greenberg Hameed.
Well, this week, Naman, the big story seems to be the SUV program. We always talk about the SUV program, but the numbers are starting to come in and they're rather startling.
Right. When we look at the breakdown in the article, we talk about a 73% refusal for designated entities for applications filed under the SUV program, where the commitment certificate was issued by an incubator, 85% where the entity was an angel.
So what happened? We've been pulling our own data, keeping a close eye on this. And as of the last data printout we had of October 2024, the refusal rates were relatively low for the 3 years up till October.
Right.
So what happened in 2025?
Well, and even before that in 2023, I think the approval rate was about 86%.
Okay, so more to the point, 2025 is a turning point. What happened?
I think there are a number of factors. First of all, look, there's a very high inventory. There's a lot of pressure on
Right.
IRCC.
Right.
Although in the article they suggest IRCC is not suggesting that they've changed their adjudication. The reality is less officers, more files. They've got to make decisions. Number two, I think officers we've seen in procedural fairness letters, they're becoming more sophisticated. I think they can detect a good case from a bad case. And then number three, the quality of cases that are being adjudicated may be those cases that have not been well prepared or thought out.
Well, let's start with number three, because I suspect that's number one. So what's the moral of the story? What's the takeaway?
Well, firstly, look, if you're filing an application, you have to understand the mandate of the program.
Right.
Is that business innovative? Have you made the case?
Right.
How robust are your activities? Is your team well constructed? Is your business plan reasonable? That means not too ambitious, but also moving the dial. And we know that officers are going to examine all of this thoroughly with very deep, detailed questions.
So before the fairness letter arrives, it's time to revisit your application.
Right. And so we've had many clients who didn't use our services want a second opinion, which I think is very wise, particularly if you filed these applications 2 or 3 years ago. Are you in a good position? Have you done enough? Is your documentation strong? In some cases, individuals filed the application themselves. Maybe the practitioner was new to the program. I think it's really important to make sure that you strengthen everything before those officers make one of these decisions.
Agreed. The time is the present to do the fixing.
And I think I would suggest that we're probably going to see a lot of action potentially at the federal court. If the refusals are at this rate, many of these individuals invested hundreds of thousands of dollars, a lot of expectations. The stakes are high, so better to try to take the right steps as early as possible.
This conversation wouldn't be complete without discussing work permits. How do you get these opportunities, these projects off the ground if you can't get the essential workers to Canada to develop the project?
Well, particularly when we look at the article, they quote a rate of about 77% refusal rate on an SUV work permit, which seems to be up at least 20, 30, 40% from the past numbers.
Well, I think you have to put a little bit more in those work permit presentations, because it's not entirely clear what happens when an officer is looking at the PR application and the essential workers weren't even allowed to come to Canada.
So you have to make a full case about the merits of the business, your eligibility. We've seen the hot topics like not including your language results, even for the work permit, even though that's a requirement for PR. We've seen officers request information that goes much more broadly than what we had seen in the past.
I'm even wondering if you have to go further at some point in the PR application. If the work permits are not issued, I wonder if there should be a discussion about the business will be formally developed after arrival in Canada because the work permits were not issued.
It's a good point. In many situations where we've seen that issue, we've had to adjust the business plan because obviously it's a different type of activity if you're not able to be in Canada.
Right. So they kind of defeat, the IRCC kind of inhibits the development of the project and then turns around and says we're assessing the development of the project.
Right. What do you think? Do you think there's any possibility that the refusal rates, as we're getting later into the year, there's a limit on the number of work permits that Canada wants to issue? Are we seeing a trend?
Look, we know they're reducing the number of temporary residents, but I can't believe they would do it in this program. What would be the point? you might as well just figure out what you're going to do with the backlog of the applications, but I wouldn't reduce the backlog by starting with the work permits and then saying no work permit, no PR.
Well, one thing I would draw the attention of readers in ImmPulse, there's a review of a number of statistics, and IRCC has drastically reduced the number of work permits, the number of students that have come into Canada.
Yes.
There might be some, whether it's passive or active, some intention to be a little bit more judicious in
Right.
issuing these permits.
Well, it becomes more complicated because these are open work permits that don't have to work in the actual project.
Right.
So how do you, on one hand, apply for a work permit based on significant benefit and then end up coming to Canada to work in an occupation that has nothing to do with the project?
Right.
This whole process needs a review.
Correct.
Our ImmPulse also talks about the invitations that have recently been handed out or sent. I guess it just underscores that there's emphasis in certain areas. In other areas, there's no movement.
Right. So we know that the healthcare draw was favorable at 470,
Right,
much lower than the usual general draw.
right.
So that seems to be the way going forward, looking at these particular category-driven occupations. And we know that IRCC is actively looking at feedback around the program, where
Right.
they're going to try to reconstruct with the immigration plan around the corner too.
And I know we've talked about it before, but it's important for people here on temporary status, for temporary foreign workers and students to understand that they are looking at identifying individuals who are a cut above. So whether that's going to be senior managers in companies, CEOs, people with certain skill levels that are really unique and beneficial to Canada, we know that the department's thinking about this.
Right.
And that's in the next regulatory restructuring, those are going to be recognized to take the place of the lost arranged employment points,
Mhm.
which basically took all these people out of the game. They couldn't score enough
Right.
points to be invited.
Even so far as to consider requiring language test for certain types of work permit holders.
Right.
I think you're right. There's a higher standard, more strategy as to who Canada lets in.
So let's just take a moment. We know that they recognize, IRCC recognizes that this senior level is missing.
Mhm.
People are calling us all the time asking, if we move to Canada, can we stay? And we don't want to come for a year or two. But the reality is it may make sense to come as an intercompany transfer, on a 3-year transfer, or under a free trade agreement, and kind of position themselves in Canada for when the changes occur, they're going to be at the front of the line.
Right, especially that we know the department is actively looking at identifying senior managers as being a priority in the future of express entry.
Okay. So there's a lot of planning to be done now for later.
Right. If you're an SUV applicant and you're concerned about hearing about the high refusal rates, there are actions you can take. Greenberg Hameed would be pleased to connect with you and see how we can help.
Here we go.
Hi, I'm Howard Greenberg. Hi, I'm Noman Hameed.
Hi, I'm Howard Greenberg.
Hi, I'm Noman Hameed. Sorry. Okay. That's the only line you have to do consistently. Okay, try again. Let's go.
But which part should you don't want to use? Because that was like amazing stuff I just said, right? So like,
But you could probably save that for the future, right?
exactly.
How do you find his energy level? It feels a little...
Pretty high. And for a guy that's been kicked around, it's hard to believe.
violin here.
It's hard to believe I'm even sitting up. Anyways, where's the seatbelt?